Hi, and welcome to the Design Systems Podcast, the place where design and development overlap. Brought to you by Knapsack. Check us out at knapsack.cloud. Hey, everybody. Today I'm here with Gina Bhawalkar. She's a principal analyst at Forrester. She covers the experience design industry. And I'm really excited for this because we don't have a lot of people on this show that aren't directly related to building design systems. In this case, we have somebody that's on here that is related to understanding how people build systems. And so, Gina, really excited to chat with you.
Thanks, Chris. I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
So tell me a little bit about what you mean by the experience design industry.
Absolutely. So I actually spent most of my career working in the experience design industry. I led user experience teams at several companies before coming to Forrester. And the reason Forrester hired me was because I had worked in that space, but I had a really strong research background. User experience research was kind of always my first love when it came to UX. And so I was hired to basically take my research skills, but apply them in a new capacity, which is to studying the industry that I used to work on. So specifically, I research questions like, what is the best way for a company to build and scale a design practice? What are the different strategies for scaling effectively, which is, of course, where design systems come in. Mm-hmm. And also, I lead our coverage of accessibility and inclusive design, which obviously has a key connection point into design systems as well.
So because some folks might not be familiar with Forrester, like what does Forrester actually do? It's research, but then what is the outcome of that?
Absolutely. So the best way to think of us is as a research and advisory firm. So we help executives at companies. That includes design executives, IT executives, security executives. We have analysts that cover really all different spaces. We help them understand what does good look like as far as the burning questions that they have, right? So for example, I'm here to serve, design leaders and managers at companies, help them understand, what are the best ways to structure a design team and how is that working at different organizations that are effectively structuring to deliver great experiences for their customers. And then the advisory component is we work with companies to then say, okay, how can we take this research we've done, these best practices we've uncovered, and apply them to your organizational context? So I spend a lot of time working one-on-one with clients to talk about, the specific kind of nuances of their design challenges, their design system challenges, and how our research can help them accelerate that work to the next level.
So that's actually a really great lead into kind of what we're talking about today. This is about content. And I'm very excited to chat about content because I've mentioned many times on the show before that content has this powerful role to play in a design system. And it's often the least talked about or least thought of aspect of this. And one of the things that I love about your view on content is you think about it as fundamental to the foundation of a design system. And I'm really interested to hear from you in your own words, kind of, what does that foundation build from? What does that look like when somebody's first setting up a design system? How does that content influence not just the way people use the design system, but actually how you create it?
Absolutely. So it's certainly foundational. And as you mentioned, Chris, kind of the most often overlooked, I think, component. I mean, I remember back in my days as a UX designer, how often were we creating designs with Lorem, ipsum text? And, if I could give myself one piece of advice, it would be, what were you doing? You should not have been doing that. Because words...
We used to use Mr. T as our placeholder images for everything.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Love it. That's creative, but also not good. You have to,
not good,
you have to use actual images and actual content. So I mean, absolutely. From the start of creating your design system, it is critical to think about and remember that words are foundational to great experiences. And so that has a lot of implications. For example, when you're thinking about, foundational guidelines, companies are usually very focused on, okay, well, what are our best practices for use of typography, for use of color? They're not always thinking about what are the best practices to make sure that our voice and tone are reflected in product design. Mm-hmm. They're not often thinking about, okay, we've committed to being inclusive as a company. What does that actually mean in terms of the words that we use within the experience. And the end result of that is they're often inadvertently excluding, segments of their customer population because they just haven't aligned on what those best practices are and codify those in their design system so that employees can, apply and scale those consistently in their particular domains.
It's kind of the classic problem where, there's a lot of power in the ability to scale an experience across a large variety of products or a large variety of applications. Mm-hmm. But with that, you take the good with the bad, right? Like if you have a poor experience, that means that poor experience goes everywhere. If you have a really good, strong, inclusive experience, then that experience goes everywhere. And a lot of this is about how we take that expression of intent in the design landscape and really build that into the product, or the product that serves other products. When you think about the underpinnings of that, and one of the things that you mentioned to me before the show was you like to start with this foundation of principles as that expression of intent. What does that really look like? And how do you have some examples of companies that have really lived that kind of way of building?
Absolutely. I mean, we often talk about this idea of intent at Forrester as it starts with actually defining, what is the customer experience that we want to create as an organization. We call that a customer experience vision. It's that North Star, right? That everyone is working towards. Examples of that being like JetBlue, they're all about bringing humanity back to air travel. That's a very aspirational and very interesting vision. But then how do you take that and actually translate that into decisions that you're making?
Right. How does that wonderfully aspirational thing become a practical reality in a system that has to serve dozens or hundreds of products? Exactly.
And that's where, design principles are so powerful. And when I see design systems that have great component libraries, but they haven't actually kind of gone through that exercise as a company on aligning around design principles, we always want to start there, right? Because that's really going to define, what is good design for your company. And that's going to inform what you put in the system. So, I'll give you one concrete example. Going back to my inclusive example from earlier, I interviewed a large software company who one of their key components of their vision was we are going to create the most inclusive software of anyone in our space. And that's a very noble goal. But what does that actually mean? And so their design and development and product teams work together to make that actionable in their design system. So for example, their color guidance gets really, really detailed about do's and don'ts for color and how to choose and test color contrast to make sure that they're not creating barriers for people with visual challenges. Of course, it also meant that accessibility was a priority in their component libraries.
So this company, when they took these things like color and really tried to focus on the implementation of accessibility and inclusivity across their landscape, practically, how do those teams work together? Is that something where you get everybody into the same room and you say, like, let's all align around this common ideal? Is it more complicated than that? Is there some magic here that you're doing in the background to, mind control all of the individual developers and designers? How does that work from a really practical standpoint?
One important thing that has to be present is at the end of the day, you want there to be this feeling of shared ownership, right? In all of these elements that are part of your design system. So it's very important that it's not, just the design team in isolation, creating these guidelines around how we express inclusion in our products. So with that company that I was referencing earlier, they actually workshopped it. So they brought together these teams and they said, okay, we're all about being inclusive. What does that mean in a digital experience? And they actually started by setting KPIs. They're like, how will we know if we were successful in doing this?
Awesome.
An example of that being, we should see accessibility defects go down by a certain percentage because we have effectively baked accessibility into the design system. And, and then you can see how that would naturally lead to the next part of the workshop, which is, okay, for each role, for content, for design, for development, for product, what are the specific guidelines that will help us get to a state where defects have gone down by this percentage?
Yeah, one of the things I love about that example is that's all happening before like the first component is in the system. And I think that that's a really powerful thing, right? Because when you think about my color palette or typography or any number of other things that are there, right? Like these are big brand choices. They're big design choices, and those are then applied to dozens or maybe hundreds of components, depending on how you've structured your system. So deciding all this up front helps you really focus in on what matters in your system and what outcomes you're trying to achieve, less about just building up a library of reusable things. I think there's a lot of power there.
I totally agree. I mean, I think if you can stop thinking about creating your design system as, this checklist of things we need, because we saw that Google Material has this, or Salesforce Lightning has this, or, name any famous design system, and thinking about how is our design system going to help us express and achieve our aspirational vision of what a great experience is. I'll give you one more example, Chris, that's very different, but I think equally interesting. So if you go to the gov.uk design system, one of their design principles is design with data. And part of what that means for them is that we should be prototyping and testing with users and then iterating and making evidence-based decisions based on what we learn. So it's not surprising then that when you dig into their component documentation in their design system, that you actually see things like, here's the research behind this component. Like they actually describe.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, they actually describe the research findings that led them to design that component in a certain way. And they even flag components as experimental because the research hasn't been done yet to validate that that's actually kind of a proven approach to how this component should be structured.
So that's almost one step farther. Like, here's my expression of intent. Here's my validation that this expression expresses the thing I was intending it to. That's a really powerful system if you think about it. And I love that it is so baked into a principle, that idea that data matters to us. So how do we be an organization that designs with data? We bake the data platform into our system.
Yeah, they're almost also educating design system users along the way, right? Because not everyone accessing that design system has a strong understanding of what user research means, what usability testing means, and what can come out of that. And so by building that in, they're giving that user more confidence that, yes, this is a good component for me to use in my product.
So when it comes back around again, they're actually taking time to educate people about how their components really should be used.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And educating people on the importance that we are putting these ideas in front of users and that we're using the feedback that they share to continuously improve and iterate and make our design system and therefore our products better. So yeah, I think it's a pretty amazing example. And I've talked to quite a few companies in my research lately who are just recognizing that baking user research into the design system is a really cool opportunity and not something that I think enough companies are doing at this point.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think that the weight is definitely not there, right? There's so much of this is like, let's just go stand up components or let's just go stand up tokens or something like that. And there is an argument to be made that in that moment of the conception of a design system, it's oftentimes very difficult to go through these planning exercises to take these principles and to really be thoughtful about how we apply them. Oftentimes, it's just a team or some small insurgency that needs to stand something up. And so one of the things that's really awesome about your experience is you get to see sort of like the world's best, most well-developed, most thoughtful design systems. How do you go from just a team of people that is trying to stand something up to having that more thoughtful approach to that? Is that a buy-in thing? Is that a finding time thing? Is that a road mapping thing? Is it all of those things?
I think it's all of those things, but let me give you an example, Chris, that I think will illustrate a good approach to this really well. So I worked with an analytics platform vendor who they actually decided when the pandemic hit last year that they were going to use some time they had to stand up a design system. This was like a pandemic project for them. And the way that they started that, they didn't go start creating tokens, components, all the things that you're supposed to do. Their design leadership team actually went and embedded themselves in projects to learn about the specific challenges of applying design to the different, product experiences. And they were kind of an interesting challenge because they're building, software for analytics people, for data scientists. Mm-hmm. And how do you think about applying, design in that capacity? And that led to really interesting things for them. Like, really, at the end of the day, the most important thing they need to focus on was chart components. They needed to create a reusable set of chart components that data scientists and analytics professionals could pick up and use and, apply within their particular ecosystem. So that translated into things too, like, okay, yes, let's create the UI kit for Figma, but we also need to create a UI kit with these chart components for Power BI, because that's the tool that, our data analysts are living in day to day. So, I mean, you could start to see how, they went out, they studied the needs of their team. They understood what are the unique challenges for this user group of our design system. And then they directly use that to prioritize where they would focus their time.
Yeah, it's interesting. So this customer has this offering that is largely brought to people via email. And one of the things that was interesting about their design system is we initially conceived of this as something that would be content for the web, the classic, like, hey, we need to build some React components to power your design system kind of thing. And now what we've actually really started to think about is how we think about things like mustache templating for emails in the way that their design system is implemented, because that's actually the more important customer channel for them. And that's where the power of that content and that power of the expression of the brand, that expression of intent, has been severely lacking. So that delta between a web or an app experience and that email experience was a gap that we identified that needed to get filled. That's been a really powerful place where content has really helped, because we basically took a look at that design system and said, the right thing to do here is to restructure all of this sample data and sample content as if it was a newsletter piece in an email, because that's where the need really is inside of the system. When you think about specifically like the content and the voice and that expression of voice in there, how do those touches like really happen, right? Because there's tokens, right? There's brands, there's colors, there's all this other stuff like that. We laughed about Mr. T images or cats falling off of chairs or something like that. But what should that sample content really embody for people that exists inside of a system?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, one of my favorite examples here is actually Zendesk, their design system garden. You can go look at it. It's out there.
It's beautiful. I love that one. It's
beautiful. Yeah, absolutely love it. But what I love in particular is they have content principles, and then they have guidelines, in terms of how do you actually embody those principles. And, it's all around this idea of writing for everyone. And so, for example, they have a word list where they have guidance around things like, okay, we know we have customers who use screen readers. What are some implications there? So, for example, we never say learn more, because that creates repetition when a screen reader user pulls up a list of all of these links on a screen. So instead, we always need to say learn more about user profiles or whatever the particular element is. So I love how tactical they got there. I suspect they've done research with people with disabilities to help inform those guidelines, but that's one example of what we're talking about here. Another great example is Monzo in the UK. They're a digital bank, and they have a focus on designing for vulnerable customer populations. And so one way that got embodied in their content was they actually did an initiative to rewrite their terms and conditions to be less than 1,500 words, completely jargon-free at an 11-year-old reading level. I mean, what a breath of fresh air compared to...
That's amazing.
Yeah, any financial institution you've ever done business with.
Yeah, I love this idea of making things that are traditionally really complex language or traditionally click-throughs, right? Thinking about making those more accessible to people. We have a company that we're working with that is designing consent experiences. And, CCPA basically says, hey, if I'm going to collect data, CCPA, by the way, is the California Consumer Protection Act. If you're going to collect data about somebody, you have to have them specifically consent to that data collection. And that consent experience has to roll out across every app in their entire ecosystem. And in the case of this particular group, it's hundreds of apps. And the language that you choose for that consent experience is really important, because that is a reflection of your brand as it relates to any number of the sites or applications that they operate. and thinking critically about how you can put the right content actually into the design system was kind of a first for us, where we were trying to think about like, okay, what does that consent experience really embody for brand A versus brand B versus brand C? And how do we still comply with the law, but also create a way that feels inclusive to the people that would actually be visiting that site to consume that experience?
I love that example, Chris. We've actually been talking a lot within Forrester around this idea of we're calling it privacy by design, right? And how it's as important to apply user-centered design rigor to experiences like the one that you just described, to the one I described around terms and conditions, as it is to, these top task flows that users are doing on a daily basis. So that's a really cool example. It also made me think of actually, I worked with a regional bank where they were wondering when it comes to design patterns, right? So like they had component libraries and they were like, what are kind of the templates and patterns that we should create? Because we know that many, platforms are applying components and assembling them in a certain way. And this was really interesting because they decided to really hone in on global messaging. So they created extensive content in their design system around how we message to customers in different situations. And the reason they chose to do that was because they had sort of the typical kind of organizational walls, right? Where every stakeholder group felt that they should approach messaging in a different way. So it was sort of this very heated topic. And they realized that design, through the methods that we have and facilitating sessions to bring people together and to align on best practices related to a topic like global messaging, they were able to create a reusable set of patterns. And that was sort of their first go at that particular element within their design system.
Yeah, it would be really cool, and we've experimented with this a little bit, but the idea that, take a complex technical subject like personalization, right? That has a huge content tie-in. Because when I personalize content on a site and I'm changing the words that show up on the page based upon the user that is visiting that page, having that bank of content be a part of the system that you use or the systematic approach you use to building that product, that feels like a much more scalable way of building in personalization than you see. Because very often you have these huge lists of things we could say to a customer, and then there's some algorithm that chooses which one to say. But those very rarely reside in the same system. They're actually seeing that expression of intent via design or via code, in a live environment. You don't often see what that content looks like in the actual end experience. You're oftentimes just kind of seeing, hey, here's 25 different options. I think that the more powerful way of approaching that is to actually have that content reside in that same system as your components, as your principles, as your tokens, so you can actually see and really experience that intent from the point of view of the end user.
I absolutely agree. I mean, in the same way that as a company, you're probably putting a lot of rigor right now into documenting do's and don'ts for components. Wouldn't it be great if every design system had do's and don'ts for applying these content principles we've created to different types of experiences, going to your personalization point, Chris, and bringing forward those examples of how, a guideline like the one I shared earlier from Zendesk around why we don't say learn more, how that actually manifests, in different experiences. And, for example, I could imagine a common pushback there being, well, in a mobile app, we can't create these long button and link names. We don't have enough, screen real estate to do that. So how does that work? And you could bring to life through examples how you can, stay true to that important content principle within that particular platform and use those visual examples to bring it to life and to show the possibilities of how a design system can extend to many different types of experiences.
The thing that's great about this part of the conversation is we are starting to talk about architecture. We are starting to think about the way you actually go about constructing your system at a pretty fundamental level. If you have a system where you want to be inclusive around things like personalization, or you want to have these content experiences, that's very different than a system that you just want to capture your commoditized button, card, hero components. And so that shift in thinking, I think, really does represent an iterative leap, a breaking change in most people's design systems, right? When you think about, I've built this library of components, I've built this set of tokens, maybe not, I have some content that is some sample data that's in there. if I really want to have the architecture that supports my goals and my principles, that may cause people to have to really change a lot about not just the content of their system, but the way that the system is built.
Absolutely. I mean, I'll give you one example we haven't really delved into yet, Chris, but that is related to this point, which is, if you think about one benefit of a design system is to power democratization, right? Now we are able to empower non-designers to make certain design decisions because we've developed these robust standards and they're in a form that can be consumed and applied. Well, then you start to think about, okay, well, if that's a goal, then what are some of the additional elements we need in the system? I interviewed a company who wanted to empower product owners to create basic design mockups using components from their design system. And so part of their design system documentation was they had PowerPoint templates that these product owners could download, because product owners aren't as comfortable in Figma and Adobe XD and all the design tools as the rest of us. So they had these PowerPoint templates that had kind of skeletons that the product owners could essentially fill in with components and with different foundational elements to start to bring their vision for an experience to life.
Yeah.
Now, you probably wouldn't create something like that if you didn't have that goal of democratization in mind.
Yeah, that's really incredible. This idea that, hey, we have a group of people that is comfortable in PowerPoint, but uncomfortable using these other tools. Like, let's create this stopgap, or maybe even not a stopgap, maybe a more permanent solution that looks at how we address the needs of those specific people. I also love the idea that that's addressing, not just democratization, but the consumers of the design system, right? The first audience that you kind of have to reach outside that core design system team is your first consumer. So, who's not just building the system, but actually using the system once it's built. And I love the idea of innovative ways of reaching those people to get them engaged, to get them adopting the system, to get them to working in the system so they understand the value and begin to adopt the mindset or the principles that were being applied from the system's creation.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of connecting it into a point we talked about earlier, Chris, around education and kind of building education into your design system. I mean, I worked with a firm that they called it a behavioral architecture toolkit, but basically it was like a set of design thinking methods and recipes, because they realized when they were creating their design system that a lot of their users didn't actually really understand that before you go create an experience using these components from the design system, you first have to go understand the need you're solving for and define the problem and, do the upfront user research to say, what are we actually even trying to build here, by leveraging our design system. And so they actually created like a Luma Institute IDEO-like methods toolkit as part of their design system, because they wanted to encourage people, yes, there's these things over here once you're in solutioning, but before you get into solutioning, when you're in discovery and trying to understand the problem, here's how our design system can help you by giving you these tools to go out and talk to customers and to get to that layer of depth that you need in order to create the best product that you can.
Yeah, here's how you gain insight into what you actually need.
Exactly.
So I know that you talk to a lot of companies. You spend a lot of time doing research in this area. It's pretty broad, and that it crosses a wide swath of design, but it also does have some specificity into the design systems space. I'd love a little insight into understanding, what is the research telling you out in the market about design systems and about this idea of their use, their adoption, their prevalence in companies both big and small. I'm really kind of curious to hear from you, what are the areas that organizations are performing well in, and where are they still struggling with design systems?
Sure. So first of all, Chris, I mean, we're seeing that adoption of design systems is just really exploding. We actually run an annual survey. It's a global survey of design teams here at Forrester. And when we last ran it, which was in December of 2020, 65% of companies reported that they're currently using a design system. And more interesting than that was 77% of those companies said they're using a design system more than 2 years ago, which is really just our way of measuring how rapid is the growth of these as a tool to support, scaling design in a company.
So not just broad adoption, but also like really rapid growth.
Really, really rapid growth. And also, I mean, a big part of my job is doing, these kind of inquiries with companies where we have 30-minute calls and talk about the research. And my volume of inquiries on design systems has definitely doubled in the last year. Again, another sign of growth. So that's the first, point to mention. I would say a few things that we're seeing. We do still see a lot of companies that are treating their design system as something to be done, kind of the checklist approach. Like, this is part of having a mature design practice. So we're going to do a project to build a design system and then move on to the next thing. And what we, of course,
check next. Yeah.
Yeah, check next, which I'm sure all your listeners know is not the best way to approach a design system. So we've been on the lookout for examples of companies that are really embodying that idea of adopting a product mindset with your design system, which of course is not a new idea. But what we try to get at in our research is, okay, well, what are the basic best practices in order to do that? I mean, companies create a lot of digital products. What's different and what's common when it comes to creating a design system as a product. And it has been exciting, I would say, in 2021, just how a lot of the inquiries I have with organizations, they are starting to get that. And I think a lot of it is they're hearing the episodes on podcasts like yours. They're reading the case studies of companies that have been really successful here. And they're hearing, oh, wait, they have dedicated teams to support this. Oh, wait, they have, a whole governance process around this. This is more than a checklist. This is, something we need to put as much investment into as we do our mobile app or our website.
That's awesome. I love that trend. I also think one of the things that I've been hearing a lot about is this focus on adoption as like the key driver for success in a design system, right? And any design system that you can conceive of, that you can create, if it's not well adopted or well used, it's obviously not very valuable. What would you say are the key findings that you've seen around the success of adoption of design systems inside of organizations? Are there commonalities that are emerging that you're seeing that really drive the value of these systems and really the value that shows up in the landscape of like people using a system?
The number one thing, and it goes back to something we've been talking about in the episode, inclusion, but in a different capacity, is they are including many individuals within the organization in the creation of the system. For example, I'm speaking to many companies who are applying methods like journey mapping early in the creation of their design system. They are bringing designers and developers into a room. They are mapping out the designer-developer workflow when it comes to releasing a feature. And they are having these users talk and align on what are the key areas of pain, what are the key challenges in that workflow. And then that is gold for a design systems team, because you can then position and communicate the value of a design system around those key challenges. And, you could start to see then how adoption is going to be higher if you're presenting this design system as something to help with this very frustrating aspect of my day-to-day work at this company. And so I would say, that is probably the most important thing, is including design system users at many stages in the process. And hey, guess what? That's the same thing as applying human-centered design to a mobile app or website. Yeah. It's you bring users in early and often. Same idea, right? And
baking a lot of those like really thoughtful approaches into the creation and the renewal of that system. I love that. Talk to me a little bit about how organizations are changing as a result of these things, right? Like we've all lived in a bespoke app world for so long, that at most you saw people doing things like micro front ends or feature teams or whatever. But as you start to take a very centralized systems approach that has a lot of federated contribution and really federated use, is that changing the way that organizations are thinking about design and development?
It absolutely is. So I think one of the main drivers for design teams, this increasing adoption of design systems I talk about, is businesses are finally beginning to understand the value of design, and that the value of design is not just about, let's make the product look good. It's about what are the products we even need to create in the first place? And what are the core needs of the customers that we serve? And so what becomes really powerful here is when you have a design system in place, it helps you scale good design decisions at certain altitudes of decision making, right? When we're building new features in our products, the design system is going to help us do that quickly, more efficiently. Guess what? That now frees up time for your designers to work on more things. And that's important because design is getting tapped to support more projects and specifically more strategic initiatives in these companies. And we actually explore that in the survey that I referenced as well. When we ran our survey at the end of 2020, we saw the percentage of design teams who say they impact what we call big picture decisions in their companies. This would be things like, what are the segments we could be going after that we're not going after today? Or what are the needs of millennials as it relates to banking, that we could be serving better than any of our competitors? The percentage of design teams working on those challenges went up from 31% to 38% in 1 year. And that's pretty amazing. And I would attribute a lot of that to the fact that these design teams, they put in the time, they are creating and they are managing a design system effectively, and they're achieving the benefits that a design system promises. And they're able to redirect things like save time to adding value to the business in new and pretty exciting ways.
Yeah, it really relates to the conversation that we had recently with Robin and Danny from IBM and Procore, where they were talking about how design decision-making has really made it into the top priorities of a C-suite inside of organizations, right? Whereas before, alignment of a design system with like a top 2 priority in the organization was somewhat tenuous. Now it's much more direct. I can say, hey, to reach this customer segment, I need to build this capability or this new innovative feature or this new innovative application. And the way that I can do that most effectively and efficiently is with a system. And they're also starting to look at that as not just cheaper and faster, but better as well. Better because of things like inclusivity, better because of things like research baked into your design principles, which is baked into your system. All these different things that create a better experience that is beyond the idea of consistency and maintainability, right? Like we always touted that in the earlier days of design systems as being this huge benefit. But it's really more than that. It's actually the quality of the product as it relates to the design thinking that goes into it is much higher.
Absolutely. And I'll tell you, Chris, too, I've been hearing a lot lately about the employee experience benefits that come from having a design system.
Beat me to it. That was my next question.
I mean, many designers entering the field right now, this is an expectation, right? Or if you've worked at a company with a design system, you're not going to want to go to a company where you're, designing different states of an action button all day because, the company doesn't have a design system in place. So there's definitely, a benefit in terms of attracting and retaining design talent. And I've been hearing that from a lot of design leaders that I interview. The other cool benefit is I interviewed the team behind one of the most famous design systems out there. And when I asked them how they measure success, they said, we want junior designers coming into the company to feel more confident in the design decisions they make because they have the backing of our design system. And they said they're seeing that. They actually run surveys with designers where they ask them about their confidence level in recent work that they delivered. And they found that product teams that were working from the design system, they felt more confidence because everything in the design system was backed by user research. It was like this really powerful tool they had to make sure that they were doing kind of their part to deliver great customer experiences. And I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, it's awesome. Evan, one of the other founders of Knapsack, he's very fond of saying that design systems let you stand on the shoulders of giants. And that example that you just brought up where you have somebody that's brand new to an organization that has a lot of uncertainty in their decision making, that is an incredibly powerful tool for them to be able to make contributions based on the confidence, the trust, and the foundations of the people that came before them.
Absolutely. I love that quote. That's amazing.
Well, hey, Gina, this has been great. I love the conversation, love the work that you're doing, and really excited to talk again in a few months and see if these trends continue. And again, really love the focus on content that you have. It's something that I can't wait to see more conversations like this percolating in our community. So thank you very much for being on here today. Really appreciate your time and love the conversation.
Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun, Chris.
That's all for today. This has been another episode of the Design Systems Podcast. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions or a topic you'd like to know more about, find us on Twitter at the DS Pod. We'd love to hear from you with show ideas, recommendations, questions, or comments. As always, this pod is brought to you by Knapsack. You can check us out at knapsack.cloud. Have a great day.